Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're cracking open a theory of history that really pushes back against how we usually think about things, that modern linear view.
It's quite a shift in perspective.
Right, because I think most of us feel like we're standing in, well, chaos right now. There's this unprecedented national mood. Institutions seem brittle. Trust is evaporating. But our sources for this deep dive, mostly from excerpts of The Fourth Turning, they tell a really different story. They argue this isn't chaos, it's actually a rhythm.
That's the absolute core claim, isn't it? That feeling that America is unraveling right now.
Yeah.
That pessimism, the friction in society. It's not just random noise.
Okay.
The authors argue history moves in these predictable, quite profound seasons, like 80 to 100-year cycles, the same way nature moves from spring through to winter.
So the mission for us then, and for you listening, is to figure out where exactly we stand in that rhythm. We need to kind of locate ourselves, looking at what the sources call this Rubik's Cube of problems, the ones that feel perpetually tangled up. Crime, race, money, family, culture, ethics. Why do they feel so impossible to solve right now?
Well, because according to this roadmap, they are pretty much insoluble in this particular season we're in. The forecast, the sort of raw truth here is that these issues won't be solved bit by bit, incrementally. They need an inflection point.
An inflection point.
Yeah, they'll eventually snap into a fourth turning solution, which the source material defines as this intense moment of civic survival. It leads either to, well, overwhelming catastrophe or to a new American glory. Not much middle ground when the whole system resets.
Okay. Let's unpack that. This idea of cyclical time. Because, in the modern West, we're taught history just marches upward. Progress, right? Continual improvement.
Good linear view, yeah.
But these sources argue traditional civilizations understood time maybe better, measuring history by recurrence, not just a timeline. Why does this generational cycle apparently win out over our linear hopes?
It's fundamentally biological, not just political or ideological.
Right.
The key mechanism is called the saeculum.
Saeculum.
Yeah. It's roughly the length of a long human life, so fluctuating between, say, 80 and 105 years. And the really big insight here is that history shapes generations, sure, but just as powerfully, generations turn around and create history.
That feels profound, connecting these huge historical sweeps to just the simple fact that we all age. How does that biological clock drive the historical one?
Well, think about a single human life. It naturally breaks down into about 4 phases.
Yeah.
Right? Childhood, young adulthood, midlife, and elderhood, each one lasting roughly 20, 21 years.
Okay.
So as a whole society, we collectively experience history differently based on which phase of life the dominant generations are in at that moment. When the lineup changes, when a large generation moves from young adulthood into midlife, for example.
The whole mood shifts.
The entire social mood, Political
right.
demands, cultural expectations, everything shifts, quite dramatically sometimes.
I see. And that explains why linear forecasters always seem to miss the really big shifts. They look at, the quiet 1950s and just assume things will get more quiet.
Exactly. They fail to account for the fact that those post-war kids are about to hit young adulthood and maybe demand something radically different.
Right. They didn't see the 60s coming.
Precisely. They assumed the future was just more of the recent past. The sources point out that experts totally missed the cultural explosion of the 1960s because they didn't grasp this seasonality. They didn't see that post-war consensus generation aging out and, frankly, creating space for rebellion.
Okay. So if the saeculum is the big century-long cycle, the 4 shifts within it are the turnings, the seasons. This is where it gets really fascinating, mapping this onto recent U.S. history. Walk us through the mood of each, maybe starting with that post-war spring.
Right. So the cycle typically kicks off after some massive shared trauma, a crisis with the first turning, a high. Think of it as spring.
Okay. High, spring.
The societal mood is generally one of institutional strength. Things feel solid, political stability, commercial prosperity. The focus is on the community, collective survival over individual expression.
Like the post-WWII era.
Exactly. The American high, roughly 1946 to maybe 1964. The civic order felt secure, didn't it? Institutions had huge trust, and child rearing became very protective, almost indulgent, which, interestingly, creates a future generation that expects and seeks large-scale collective action later on.
But that high, that strength, eventually it breeds maybe complacency? Pushes the next generation to rebel against all that conformity.
Precisely. Which brings us to the second turning, an awakening. This is summer, a period of cultural, sometimes spiritual revelation.
Awakening. Summer.
Yeah. The focus shifts dramatically from community duty back towards individual rights, self-expression. Those institutions that seemed rock solid in the high, they start to weaken under pretty heavy criticism from within. And the generation gap becomes a major theme.
The 60s and 70s.
Absolutely. The consciousness revolution, say 1964 through the mid-1980s, that perfectly illustrates it. At a time defined by intense spiritual searching, cultural critique, demands for personal freedom.
Okay. And then once that revolutionary energy kind of burns out, the institutions are left weakened and we enter the season that, it feels like it describes our recent past pretty well. The third turning. And unraveling. Autumn.
That's it, the unraveling, autumn. It's defined by entropy, really, decay. Society leans hard into self-reliance, pragmatism, skepticism. Public trust, which was just criticized during the Awakening, now pretty much collapses.
Right.
Culture splinters into all sorts of niche groups. Those intense culture wars we hear so much about, they're a classic symptom of this fragmentation.
Yeah.
And because collective public action feels almost impossible.
Well, just defer the big problem.
Exactly. Critical community problems get perpetually kicked down the road. Individualism really peaks here. The sources suggest this phase started around the mid-1980s, and we've been living in its long shadow.
Yeah, you can see that deferral. Infrastructure, long-term debt, environmental stuff.
Right.
For decades now. It feels like every year the system just barely manages to avoid dealing with it and, the road's running out.
That is the absolute hallmark of the unraveling. It's when society gets comfortable with complexity, even pessimism, because deep down, nobody really trusts anyone else to fix things together.
Grim.
It is. But autumn inevitably gives way to winter, the fourth turning. A crisis.
And this is the danger zone.
Maximum danger, yeah. The old civic order, the one that coasted through the unraveling, simply cannot cope anymore. The stress of all those deferred problems comes back with a vengeance.
So what happens?
This era demands a complete, renewed sense of unity, self-sacrifice, often an existential fight for civic survival. The crisis is described as a time of wrenching upheaval. The fundamental nature of the nation gets questioned, redefined, and the outcome determines whether the cycle resets to a new high or if the society fractures entirely.
Wow. Okay. So the seasons set the mood, the problems, but then it's the generations within those seasons, right? The four archetypes, prophet, nomad, hero, artist, they dictate how we react, especially in a crisis, based on where they are in their life cycle.
Exactly. The generational position is crucial.
Let's look at the current constellation then. This feels like vital information because these are the people driving the action right now or soon will be.
Absolutely.
We start with the prophets, the baby boomers, born during the high, now entering elderhood. What's their role in this coming crisis?
So because they were born after the last big crisis, WWII, during that time of security, they tend to grow up as principled moralists.
Okay.
They're driven more by conviction than by, say, pragmatism.
Yeah.
In a crisis, they tend to trade their material comfort for moral authority. They enter elderhood holding this torch of conviction, setting these often unyielding, high-stakes moral examples. They dominate the national ethical debate, often with a kind of righteous, polarizing energy. They basically define what the fight is about.
Okay. Then next, the nomads. That's Gen X, the 13th generation. Hitting midlife. The kind of core position of power management. Why are they the practical ones to run the crisis?
Well, they had a noticeably different upbringing, didn't they? More hard-scrabble, often unsupervised childhoods during the cultural chaos of the Awakening and the fragmentation of the unraveling.
Right, latchkey kids and all that.
Yeah. So they tend to be pragmatic, street-smart, defined by a higher tolerance for risk. They don't really expect praise. In a crisis, they become these crucial on-site tacticians and behind-the-scenes bosses.
The fixers.
The fixers, exactly.
Yeah.
The people figuring out the gritty, immediate solutions on the ground, often without much concern for the long-term moral arguments the prophets are having. They bring the toughness, the resolution, while the prophets provide the righteous fire.
Which brings us to the heroes, the millennials. They're hitting young adulthood now, traditionally the age for fighting, for massive collective action.
Right. The heroes were raised during the unraveling, that pessimistic time, but often very protected by their parents. Remember all the decade of the child policies, the focus on teamwork?
Her helicopter parent.
Sort of the societal version of that, yeah. They grew up seeking maybe more centralized authority, looking for collective achievement. So consequently, the theory predicts they'll be the young adult soldiers of crisis. They'll seek big, public, defining civic deeds, ready to unite under clear leadership to tackle the huge challenges the older generations left behind.
And finally, the oldest generation still significantly present, the artists, the silent generation. They saw the last crisis as kids. Now they're the anxious elders.
Yeah, they're the quiet, adaptive generation. Now in their twilight years, described as iconoclastic connoisseurs, they've seen the system break before, but they're too old now to lead the massive overhaul themselves.
So what's their role?
It's kind of a frustrating one, according to the theory. They have to bear witness to this defining event of their adult lives, but they also need to sort of disengage, actively refrain from interfering too much. They need to let the maybe messiness of the nomads and heroes play out, because that's what's needed for the cycle to renew.
Wow. So you've got the lineup. Boomers providing the moral fire and definition, Gen X running the gritty logistics, millennials providing the boots on the ground for collective action. That's a powerful engine for systemic change. Almost terrifying.
It is, and the sources stress this again and again. The rhythms, the seasons, they feel inevitable. But the actual outcome is not written in stone.
Okay, that's important.
We can't stop winter from coming, but we can prepare for it. And the theory offers some surprisingly blunt, direct advice for navigating this unraveling and facing the crisis ahead.
Let's spend some time on that advice, because this is where it shifts from just theory to, personal application. What can you do? The first piece is rectify. What does that mean practically?
Rectify means consciously returning to classic, almost foundational virtues. It's a call to build a reputation for honor, integrity, self-restraint now, before the crisis really hits.
Why now?
Because the sources are really clear. During the unraveling, your personal reputation might feel like it only matters online, on LinkedIn or whatever. But when a crisis hits, your community reputation, that becomes profoundly important. Loyalty, trustworthiness, integrity, these become like social currency, maybe more valuable than actual cash when systems get stressed. Decentralized networks need maximum trust to function under pressure. You're essentially building social capital for a time when things might fall apart.
That's a stark thought. If the system wobbles, who you are matters more than what you own. Okay, the second piece of advice, brace. This is serious. This is where they get direct about institutional failure.
Very direct. Brace is basically the call to gird yourself, prepare yourself for the weakening or potentially the total collapse of public support systems we take for granted. The advice is pretty unfiltered. You should probably assume the government won't be able to honor every promise. Specifically, things like Social Security and Medicare, at least not in their current form, unless they're maybe radically means-tested.
Wow.
So the pragmatic response is to aim for radical self-sufficiency. Practice good health habits now, because you might not be able to rely on heavily subsidized healthcare to fix the results of bad habits later. It's a fundamental shift from expecting centralized security to aiming for absolute personal resilience.
That's a huge claim. Discounting the bedrock of modern American security, how does that mindset connect to the third piece of advice? Hedge.
Hedging follows logically. It means financial and strategic diversification against maximum potential risk. The sources actually recommend avoiding things like heavily leveraged investments or massive long-term debt that depends entirely on current market stability holding up.
So financial advice.
Partly financial, yeah, and it's seasonal. Like during the unraveling, maybe profit from individualism, invest in equities. But stay acutely alert for the moment the crisis really catalyzes, because that can trigger what they call a great devaluation.
A great devaluation, meaning like current money asset values could plummet during the economic chaos of a crisis.
What precisely? But maybe the most crucial part of hedging isn't even financial. It's cognitive.
How so?
The sources strongly urge you to become more of a generalist, not just a hyper-specialist. Think about it. A specialist thrives only when the environment is stable, when all the support structures around them are working perfectly.
Right.
A generalist has broader, maybe more practical survival know-how. Basic health, mechanical skills, social skills, maybe even tactical awareness. If the power grid has issues, your deep knowledge of corporate tax law might be less useful than knowing how to fix a generator or purify water.
Become more resilient in yourself, not just your finances.
Exactly. Broaden your skill set.
Okay. This deep dive has given us a really intense, comprehensive map. You've got the Saeculum, this long cycle, driving four predictable turnings the high, the awakening, the unraveling we're in or leaving, and this inevitable crisis, winter. And it's all powered by the aging and actions of these generational archetypes. Prophet, nomad, hero. We're heading into winter, defined by maximum danger, upheaval.
And yet we return to that final critical point. The one that gives you agency. The outcome isn't predetermined. History flows in these cycles, yes, but people still make choices that matter along the way.
Like the Civil War example.
Yeah, the Civil War was an anomaly in their model. It arrived about a decade early, suggesting that human decisions, collective choices, can fundamentally alter the course, or at least the timing, even within the cycle's constraints.
So it is you, the listener, who will, in a way, craft the myths and legends around whatever happens next, whatever today's Americans do in this coming time of trial. Your decisions now, whether you choose to rectify, brace, or hedge, they matter. What choices will you make when that Rubik's Cube finally snaps into place?
That's the question, isn't it?
And that's where we'll leave this deep dive.